Hello everyone and welcome back to your worst nightmare YouTube channel. To help us feel even more connected as a community, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. If you would like to share some of your horror encounter, do well to email us through the description of this video. Don't forget to smash the like and subscribe button. Thanks. Now, back to today's episode. It started with a message, something so innocent and casual that I almost missed it. The little ping from my phone, just another DM in a sea of notifications. Hey, I think I sat next to you on the flight yesterday. You had on that red hoodie, right? I frowned, staring at my phone. Yesterday? Flight? I hadn't been on a flight yesterday. In fact, I hadn't flown in months. I was sure of that. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the message. It was from someone named Jenna. Her profile picture showed a girl with wavy blonde hair, her smile as wide as a runway. Cute, but I didn't recognize her. Maybe she had me mixed up with someone else. I think you might have the wrong person, I typed back, hoping that would be the end of it. Moments later, another ping. No, I'm pretty sure it was you. Seat 24A, right? Window seat. You were asleep most of the time. Now, my stomach dropped. 24A. That was my favorite spot on any flight. I always booked the window seat. But there was no way this girl could know that. Was she stalking me? I did what any rational person would do. I left her on read and ignored it. I wasn't going to let some random girl creep me out. I figured it was a scam or some bizarre attempt at starting a conversation. But it didn't sit right with me. A chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, as I was lying in bed, another message came through. You didn't even say goodbye. Rude. Okay. Now, it was getting weird. My heart started racing. I considered blocking her, but a part of me wanted to know more. It was like watching a car crash. You don't want to look, but you can't turn away. I wasn't on a flight yesterday, I replied, my fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. Sure you were, she responded almost instantly. You sat next to me. We talked about movies. You said you loved the in-flight snacks. You even told me you were going to miss me when we landed. That was a lie. I don't talk to strangers on planes. I don't ever talk to strangers anywhere, especially not in such a friendly, open way. And then there was the weird part. There hadn't been a flight. This was starting to feel like some kind of sick prank. I didn't reply, hoping she'd give up and leave me alone. But she didn't. She never did. The next morning, I woke up to another notification. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a photo. It was me, sitting in 24A on a plane. I stared at the screen in disbelief. There I was, my head resting against the window, my red hoodie bunched up under my chin like a pillow. The plane seats, the overhead compartments, the soft glow of the cabin lights, it all looked so real. Too real. But I hadn't been on a flight. Panic washed over me. Had someone taken an old photo of me? Maybe Jenna was a hacker, someone who'd scoured my social media for pictures and was trying to mess with my head. But the thing was, I didn't recognize this picture. I had no memory of ever sitting like that, wearing that hoodie, on any plane. And then, another message. You really don't remember, do you? I slammed my phone down, my heart pounding. My hands felt clammy, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation. But none of it made sense. I thought about calling a friend, telling them about this girl, but it sounded insane. Who would believe me? Some random person on the internet claiming to have sat next to me on a flight I never took. I could already hear the sarcasm dripping from their voices. Oh yeah, totally. Super creepy. Maybe she's a ghost. I decided to block her. It was the only thing I could think to do. I went into the settings, found her profile, and hit block user. Done. Problem solved. Or so I thought. A few days later, I got an email. No subject line. The sender's address was just a string of random numbers and letters, but I recognized the name. Jenna. I opened it, my skin crawling, regretting my decision immediately. The email was brief. Just 2 words. Miss you. And attached was another photo. This time, it wasn't me on the plane. It was a selfie. Jenna's face filled the frame, her eyes wide and intense, her smile too wide, too manic. But behind her, in the background, were rows of plain seats, and in one of those seats, the one behind her was me. Same red hoodie. Same window seat. Same blank expression. I wasn't asleep this time. I was staring directly at the camera. By this point, I was spiraling. I hadn't been on any planes, and yet there I was, sitting on one, twice now. The logical side of my brain was screaming that this had to be a prank. Maybe someone had edited these pictures, using some high-tech software to paste me into them. But then, how did they know my seat? My hoodie. The way I slept. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'd hear a ping from my phone, another photo, another message. I started staying away from airports altogether. Just driving by one made my skin crawl. And then it happened. I was at a coffee shop, sipping on a latte, trying to distract myself with work when I heard it. The sound of someone pulling a chair across the floor and sitting down at the table next to me. Hey, stranger. My blood froze. I looked up slowly, praying that I was imagining things. But there she was. Jenna. Her smile was just as wide as in the pictures. Just as unsettling. Flight 24A, right? She said, tapping the rim of her coffee cup. You were right. The snacks are pretty good. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stared at her. I wanted to get up, run, anything to get away from her. Miss me, she whispered, her voice sickly sweet. I never even saw her stand up. She just vanished. And then my phone vibrated on the table. See you on the next flight. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the message, heart pounding, mind racing. I glanced around the coffee shop, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no sign of her. No sound of footsteps leaving. Nothing. It was like she had evaporated into thin air. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and scanned the room, praying for some explanation. I forced myself to stand up, legs weak beneath me, and stumbled outside. The air was crisp, biting against my skin, but it did nothing to clear the fog in my mind. I glanced at the screen of my phone one last time before shoving it deep into my pocket. No more messages. But the question haunted me. How had she known where I was? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator, every tiny noise seemed amplified, like Jenna could be hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. My phone buzzed constantly, but I refused to check. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing her face again. The next morning, I had to know. I logged into my airline account, scanning through my history, even though I knew what I would find. I hadn't been on a flight in months. Not a single record matched up. But then I saw it. A flight booked in my name. Seat 24A. Departure in 2 days. To a city I had never heard of. Panic gripped me. I called the airline, explaining there had to be some mistake. But they were calm, professional. The reservation was correct, they insisted. My card had been used. Everything was in order. The day of the flight, I didn't leave my house. I locked every door, drew every curtain. The hours ticked by painfully, and with each passing minute, I prayed this nightmare would end. I didn't check my phone. I didn't dare. It wasn't until that evening, long after the flight had departed, that I allowed myself to glance at my notifications. There was only one message. You missed your flight. I stared at it for a long time. Then the second message came. Don't worry. I'll be seeing you very soon. I hope I don't see her ever again. My name's Ethan, and I had never been afraid of flying. In fact, I loved it. I'd always request a window seat, watch the world shrink beneath me, feel that strange sense of superiority as I soared through the clouds like a king of the skies. That was until I boarded Flight 739 to Chicago. The first sign that something was off came even before takeoff. There was this guy a few rows back, nervous, jittery. He kept messing with his seatbelt, clicking it in and out, in and out. You'd think he was waiting for a roller coaster to start. At first, I found it kind of funny, nudged the woman next to me and said that he's never flown before. She didn't laugh. She just gave me this tight-lipped smile and went back to reading her Kindle. We took off, everything normal at first. Seatbelt sign on, flight attendants doing their overly rehearsed safety demo. Yeah, we get it. The oxygen masks will drop down. I've never met anyone who's actually paid attention to that part. And then we were airborne. The plane leveled out, drinks were served, and I settled into my usual routine, headphones in, playlist queued up, and a gin and tonic in hand. It was just supposed to be another uneventful flight. But then, about an hour in, the plane hit turbulence. Not the regular bumps, no. This was different. The whole cabin jolted hard enough that my gin splashed all over my tray table. People gasped, but the pilot came on to calm everyone down. Folks, this is your captain speaking. Just some rough air up ahead. We'll try to climb above it in a few minutes. I didn't think much of it. Planes hit turbulence all the time, right? We were fine. At least, that's what I told myself. Except the jittery guy behind me was now full on muttering to himself. I caught snippets of it over my music. Something about this isn't right and it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Yeah, that didn't help. Things started escalating quickly after that. The turbulence got worse, so bad that the overhead bins started rattling, a couple even popped open, and one woman's suitcase tumbled out and smacked the guy in the head. The flight attendants were strapped in, white-knuckling their seats. I glanced out the window. It was dark out there, no sign of any storm, just the endless, inky sky. So why did it feel like the plane was shaking apart? That's when it happened. A deafening crack, followed by a sudden lurch. The plane dipped hard, like we just dropped out of the sky. The woman next to me screamed, and I swear my heart stopped. I grabbed the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. I wasn't alone. Everyone around me was gripping their seats, eyes wide, trying to process what was happening. It was like the entire cabin had become a pressure cooker, with panic boiling just beneath the surface. The captain's voice came on again, but this time, it wasn't calm. Folks, we're experiencing a bit of a technical issue. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for possible emergency descent. Emergency descent. I didn't have time to fully digest what that meant before the plane tilted again, this time sharply to the left. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, flailing like ghostly arms in front of us. People were now fully losing it, crying, praying, yelling for the attendants who, by the way, looked just as terrified as we did. I put my mask on, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Was this it? Was I really about to die like this, on some random Tuesday, on a flight I didn't even want to take? My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my mom. "Hope your flight's going well, sweetie." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the lights flickered and the plane dropped, like, really dropped. My stomach shot up into my throat as we fell. It wasn't turbulence anymore. It felt like the plane had lost power. People were being thrown against their seatbelts. Anything not strapped down went flying, and all I could hear was the sound of metal groaning, like the plane was coming apart piece by piece. I swear time slowed down in that moment. Every second felt like an eternity. The guy behind me was now shouting something about the engines failing. I didn't even know he was a mechanic or some kind of engineer. I just thought he was another freaked out passenger like the rest of us. The plane started to stabilize, but we were still falling fast. I couldn't tell if we were plummeting to our deaths or if the pilots had some kind of plan. All I could do was stare out the window, watching as the black sky turned into clouds, then into patches of land, rushing up to meet us. The captain came on again, barely audible over the chaos. "Brace for impact." I couldn't breathe. This was it. The moment that every documentary or crash survival story always glosses over, the sheer terror of knowing you're about to die. I bent forward, arms wrapped around my head, waiting for the ground to hit. But then something strange happened. The plane jerked one more time, but this time, it wasn't a free fall. We were gliding, or at least, it felt like we were. The ground came closer and closer, but not as fast as before. I dared to open my eyes. We weren't crashing. Not really. The plane was descending, but it was controlled. Like the pilots had somehow, miraculously, regained enough control to land us. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. We hit the ground hard, bounced once, and skidded across a rough patch of earth before screeching to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then, one by one, people started cheering, sobbing, hugging strangers. We were alive. Turns out, we'd lost an engine mid-flight, and the pilots had executed an emergency landing on some remote strip of land. I don't remember much after that. Paramedics, fire trucks, news crews. But I do remember one thing, that nervous guy. He wasn't just a random passenger. He was an off-duty airline technician who'd noticed something wrong with the plane during boarding. And apparently, he'd been right. So, yeah, I'm not scared of flying anymore. But every time I board a plane, I double-check my seatbelt. You know, just in case. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A work conference in Denver, the kind you don't really want to go to but can't avoid. I grabbed an aisle seat, hoping for a quick nap, and boarded the plane like it was just another day. You know, the usual pre-flight routine: dodge the crying baby, pray the guy next to me doesn't hog the armrest, and hope for some free peanuts. But something felt off right from the start. The first sign: the flight attendants. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure they deal with some wild situations up in the air, but they looked tense. You know that fake smile they give you when they greet you at the door? Well, theirs was stretched a little too tight. Their eyes were darting back and forth, scanning the cabin like they were expecting something to go wrong. I should have listened to my gut then and there. But no, I brushed it off. I mean, who am I to question the professionals, right? We took off without a hitch. Smooth ascent, clear skies, the whole deal. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and I pulled out my phone to scroll mindlessly through some emails. That's when I noticed the woman across the aisle. She was staring out the window, her knuckles white, gripping the armrest like her life depended on it. I leaned over, giving her a half smile. Not a fan of flying, huh? She didn't even look at me, just shook her head. her voice barely a whisper. Something's wrong with the plane. Now, at this point, I was still in the nothing to worry about mindset. People freak out on planes all the time. I've seen my fair share of nervous flyers, but this lady, her fear was contagious. Her eyes weren't just anxious, they were terrified. I was about to ask her what she meant when the plane jolted. Not the usual turbulence bump. No, this was a full-body lurch, like we hit something midair. I sat up straight, heart hammering in my chest. A few rows up, someone's drink spilled, and I heard the flight attendants rushing up and down the aisles. Their footsteps hurried. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, trying to keep it calm, but not doing a great job of it. Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and buckle your seatbelts. Unexpected turbulence. Right. The plane kept shaking, and the lights flickered above us. I could hear people starting to murmur, some gripping their seats, others shooting nervous glances toward the windows. The woman next to me was muttering under her breath, something about the engine. I tried to tune her out, but then the sound hit me, a deep, grinding noise, like metal on metal, coming from below the floor. It wasn't loud, but once you noticed it, you couldn't ignore it. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, trying to look composed, but her eyes were wide. I could feel the panic rising in the cabin. People were whispering, some already reaching for their phones, probably to text loved ones, just in case. My heart raced, and I suddenly had this ridiculous urge to make a joke. You know, to break the tension. But nothing funny was coming to mind, not even a stupid comment about airplane food. The grinding sound grew louder. Something was definitely wrong, and it wasn't just turbulence. Another announcement from the captain. This time, he wasn't trying to sugarcoat it. We've encountered an issue with one of our engines. We're going to initiate an emergency descent. Flight attendants, prepare for impact. I swear the air got sucked out of the cabin. Emergency descent. Prepare for impact. It felt like I'd been slapped across the face. People started freaking out, grabbing their masks before they even dropped, trying to remember all those safety instructions none of us ever really paid attention to. A woman a few rows up screamed, and a baby started wailing. It was chaos. Then the plane dropped. Hard. My stomach shot up into my throat, and the whole cabin tilted as we dove. It wasn't like the slow descent you get when landing. No, this felt like we were plummeting, free-falling through the sky. The overhead bins popped open, and someone's laptop went flying past me, crashing into the aisle. The oxygen masks fell. You've seen it in movies, right? But nothing prepares you for seeing those flimsy yellow masks dangling in front of your face like some kind of sick joke. I grabbed mine, yanked it over my nose and mouth, and tried to breathe. But here's the thing they don't tell you. When you're in the middle of an actual plane crash, your body doesn't care about oxygen. It's too busy trying not to pass out from sheer terror. I could barely think, my mind racing. This was it. This was how it was going to end. Some random business trip to Denver, and I'd end up a headline on the evening news. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto the mask. The cabin was full of panicked cries, and I kept looking around, waiting for someone, anyone, to say it was going to be okay. But no one did. We kept falling, and the noise from outside got louder. It sounded like the whole plane was being torn apart. I glanced at the window next to me, half expecting to see the engine on fire. But it wasn't fire that caught my eye, it was the ground. Fast. Too fast. We're not going to make it, the woman across from me whispered, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't say anything. I just stared, numb, bracing for the moment we hit. And then, we didn't. The plane shuddered, jerking violently as the engines roared to life, sputtering like an old car engine trying to catch its breath. We leveled out, sort of. We were still descending, but the free fall had stopped. The captain came on again, his voice strained, but there was a sliver of hope this time. We've regained some control. We'll be attempting an emergency landing. Attempting. Not we're landing, but attempting. The ground kept rushing up, and I clenched my fists, holding on for dear life. The plane hit the ground hard, bouncing once, then twice, before screeching to a stop on a rough patch of dirt. Everything was shaking, people were screaming, but somehow, miraculously, we were in one piece. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. We were alive, but I couldn't process it. My brain was too fried from the sheer terror of the last 10 minutes. Slowly, people started unbuckling, sobbing, hugging strangers. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, trying to maintain some order, but they were just as shaken as we were. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, my entire body trembling. We had survived. Later, we found out the left engine had malfunctioned mid-flight, nearly tearing itself apart. The pilots? Heroes. They managed to land us in the middle of a barren strip of land in Utah. But for a few minutes there, we were all certain we weren't going to make it. So, yeah, I've been in a plane crash. And if you're wondering, no, I didn't get the peanuts. I never used to believe in all that supernatural nonsense. You know the type, demons, creatures lurking in the dark, things that fly in the night. I mean, come on, right? We live in the 21st century. But after what happened on Flight 362, I don't think I can ever look at the world the same way again. Let me back up a bit. It was supposed to be a routine flight from LAX to Tokyo. I'm a software consultant, so long flights are part of the job. I had my noise-canceling headphones, a window seat, and a downloaded playlist of podcasts to get me through the 11-hour flight. Everything was fine. Normal, even. We had boarded smoothly. The passengers seemed the usual mix of travelers, exhausted parents, backpackers, business people. Typical red-eye crowd. About 3 hours in, somewhere over the Pacific, things started to feel weird. I know that's vague, but it's hard to explain. You ever get that feeling like you're being watched, but you can't pinpoint why? It's the same feeling I had. The plane was quiet, too quiet, and even though people were dozing off, it felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath. No turbulence, no crying babies, nothing. Just silence. I tried shaking it off. I mean, I wasn't new to flying, and anxiety mid-flight was hardly unusual. But when I looked out the window into the pitch-black night, I swear I saw something. Not a flash of light or another plane. This was darker than the night around it. Like a shadow in the sky. I blinked and looked again, but it was gone. Weird, right? But not enough to freak me out. I went back to my podcast, trying to focus. That's when I noticed the flight attendants. They had been walking the aisles for a while, doing their usual thing, offering water, picking up trash, but now they were huddled near the back of the plane. I could see them whispering to each other, looking nervous, their eyes darting toward the cockpit every few seconds. Now, I'm not a paranoid guy, but if the people who are supposed to be calm in an emergency start acting weird, that's when I get concerned. Then the seatbelt sign ding-dong. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll update you as soon as we have more information. Minor technical difficulties. In the air, over the Pacific Ocean, with nothing but water for hundreds of miles. No, thank you. That's when my anxiety started to creep in. You know, the kind that makes your palms sweat and your heart rate jump just a little too fast. And then it happened. A loud bang rocked the plane, followed by a sudden lurch to the left. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin as passengers clutched their seats. It wasn't turbulence, though. No, this was something else. It felt like something had hit us hard. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then went out entirely. We were plunged into darkness, and the only thing I could hear was the terrified murmur of passengers and the low rumble of the engines. I pulled off my headphones, heart pounding in my chest. Seconds later, the emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow. The cabin was quiet, too quiet, and then I saw the flight attendants. One of them, a tall, blonde woman, was standing in the aisle, but she wasn't moving. Her face was pale, almost gray, and she was staring straight ahead. Not at anyone in particular, just staring. I waved a hand, trying to catch her attention, but she didn't react. She just stood there, completely frozen, like she was stuck in some kind of trance. "What the hell?" the guy next to me whispered, looking just as freaked out as I felt. That's when the whispers started. Low at first, like a soft breeze, but they grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from any of the passengers, though. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. My head felt like it was vibrating from the sheer intensity of the sound. I looked around, hoping for an explanation, but no one else seemed to know what was happening. The businessman across the aisle was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. A mother was holding her child, rocking back and forth with wide, terrified eyes. Then, through the eerie red glow of the emergency lights, I saw movement. A figure at the front of the plane, stepping out of the cockpit. But it wasn't the captain, or even one of the flight attendants. No, this figure was wrong. All wrong. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head tilted at an angle that seemed impossible. And the way it moved, jerky, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure was still there, walking slowly down the aisle. As it passed, passengers slumped in their seats, unconscious or worse. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were urging the figure forward. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could barely move. I managed to glance out of the corner of my eye and saw the businessman next to me, eyes wide, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This isn't real." But it was real. Too real. The figure stopped in the middle of the cabin, turning its head slowly toward me. Its face, or lack of one, was a blank, featureless void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to suck in the dim red light around it. My body went cold. My muscles locked up, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was like staring into a black hole, something that shouldn't exist, something that broke the very laws of nature. It started moving again, slowly making its way down the aisle, disappearing toward the back of the plane. The whispers faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. And just like that, the lights flickered back on. The flight attendants were moving again, as if nothing had happened. The passengers who had slumped in their seats moments ago were groggily waking up, looking confused but unharmed. No one screamed. No one panicked. It was as if no one had even noticed. I glanced at the businessman, but he was already leaning back, eyes closed, snoring softly like nothing had happened. My heart was still racing, my palms still clammy, but no one else seemed to care. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know what I saw that night, or why it chose to show itself to me. But one thing's for sure, I haven't set foot on a plane since. So if you ever find yourself on a late-night flight, cruising over the Pacific, and the lights flicker out, remember this story. And pray you don't see it too. We were headed to my sister's wedding in Cancun, me, my wife Sarah, and our two boys, Dylan and Max. We were all a little tired, a little excited, and maybe a little too caffeinated. But nothing unusual, right? A typical family trip. Except that this flight wasn't typical. It's funny, isn't it? How quickly things can change. 1 minute, you're watching your kids argue over which movie to watch on the in-flight screen, and the next, you're questioning reality itself. But let me start from the beginning. We boarded the plane, Flight 819, around 8:30 p.m., a red-eye to Cancun. The plane was packed. There's something about vacation flights that brings out the masses. You could feel the mix of anticipation and exhaustion in the air. People jostling for overhead bin space, flight attendants running through their safety demos, the works. We had decent seats, right by the wing. Not bad for a budget airline. Sarah had a window seat, Dylan sat next to her, then Max, and finally me on the aisle. Everything was normal for the first hour. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to get through the backlog of emails from work, half listening to the flight attendants clinking carts down the aisle. It was all ordinary. Until it wasn't. We hit turbulence. You know, the kind that rattles your teeth a little, makes you clutch the armrests just a bit tighter. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. Just a little bump, folks. Please stay in your seats. Standard stuff. Except it didn't stop. The bumps got worse. Like, way worse. You could hear the engines groan against the wind as the plane jolted like a carnival ride from hell. Overhead bins started rattling. A few popped open, spilling bags and jackets into the aisles. A woman a few rows ahead of us screamed. Now, I've been on a lot of flights, and turbulence, while uncomfortable, never really phases me. But this was different. The plane wasn't just shaking. It felt like it was falling. Dad, are we okay? Dylan asked, his voice trembling. Yeah, bud, I lied, just a little bumpy. We're fine. Then came the drop. I swear to you, the plane dropped. Just like that. 1 second we were cruising, and the next, we were in free fall. People screamed. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it felt like she might break it. The kids were white-knuckling their seats. I could see the panic spreading across the faces of everyone around us, and it was infectious. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The plane leveled out. Everyone took a breath, exchanging uneasy glances. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, and then dimmed to that weird, low-light mode they use for night flights. A few attendants came out to check on people, offering calm reassurances. Here's where it gets strange. The captain's voice came on again. Except this time, it sounded off. Fuzzier, distorted somehow. Folks, we've encountered a small technical issue. Nothing to worry about. We'll be descending for a bit. Just stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. A small technical issue. After we just dropped like a rock. Yeah, sure. Sarah leaned over. Does that sound weird to you? She whispered. I nodded, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease. We were descending, just like the captain said, but we weren't slowing down. In fact, it felt like we were descending too fast. The plane was eerily silent now, except for the distant hum of the engines. That's when I noticed something. The sky outside wasn't normal. It was dark, sure, but not the deep blue-black of night you'd expect at 30,000 feet. It was gray. Thick, suffocating gray. Like we were flying through a cloud, except this cloud never ended. The wingtip lights barely pierced the haze. I glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else was noticing this. But most of the passengers were glued to their screens, trying to distract themselves. Then, a voice. It wasn't the captain this time. It was a whisper, low and barely audible. At first, I thought it was just the static of the intercom, but it was there, under the noise. It said, "Look outside." I froze. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me not to, but my eyes drifted to the window anyway. And what I saw, I can barely explain. There was something outside the plane. A shadow moving alongside us, just out of sight. It wasn't another aircraft, I knew that much. It was too big. It clung to the wing like it belonged there, shifting, undulating, like smoke but solid. I blinked, shook my head, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart was racing now. I leaned across the kids to Sarah's window and peeked outside. Same thing. That same impossible shadow, keeping pace with the plane. But every time I tried to focus on it, it dissolved into nothing. Then came the announcement, louder this time, but still distorted. "Folks, we're experiencing some unusual weather conditions. We'll be landing shortly. Remain calm." Unusual weather conditions. What was that supposed to mean? I glanced at the flight map on the screen in front of me. The plane was nowhere near Cancun. In fact, it was off the map entirely, a blinking dot floating in a sea of digital nothing. People around us were starting to notice now. Whispers, nervous glances, the flight attendants moving a little too quickly up and down the aisles. One of them, a young guy with wide eyes, leaned in close as he passed us and muttered, "Stay buckled. Don't look out the windows." That was it. No more explanation. Just that cryptic warning. I looked at Sarah, and she looked at me. Neither of us said anything, but we didn't have to. We both knew something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, this time with a stomach-turning twist that sent more than a few people screaming. The shadow outside shifted, swirling faster, tighter around the wings. Then, out of nowhere, the landing gear deployed with a heavy clunk. We were landing. But where? The gray outside the windows thickened, and then, through the haze, I saw it, a runway. Not Cancun, not any airport I recognized. Just a strip of cracked concrete surrounded by nothing. The wheels hit the ground, hard. The whole plane shook as we screeched to a halt. There was no welcome from the captain. No announcement. Just the hiss of the doors opening. The flight attendants hurried everyone out. No explanations, no answers. And as we stepped off that plane into the cool, empty air, I turned around for one last look. That shadow, it was still there, lingering, watching. And just like that, the doors slammed shut behind us. I should have known something was wrong the moment she stepped onto the plane. It wasn't anything obvious at first. In fact, she seemed pretty normal, mid-30s, wearing a nondescript gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She held a worn-out duffel bag tight to her chest as she shuffled down the aisle of the cramped, budget flight from Chicago to Denver. To anyone else, she might have looked like any other exhausted traveler, but there was something about the way she moved that caught my eye. I'd always been a people watcher. It's the only thing that keeps me sane during long flights, staring out at the sea of strangers and wondering what kind of lives they lead. But this woman, she didn't fit into any of my usual categories. Too jittery. Too stiff. She didn't even make eye contact with anyone as she walked by, her whole body tense as if she expected something bad to happen any second. I tried to shake off the feeling. Probably just scared of flying, I told myself, taking a sip of the terrible airplane coffee. But as she squeezed past me to sit by the window in my row, I noticed how pale her hands were. Almost bloodless. She didn't say a word when she sat down, just stuffed her bag under the seat and stared out the window. The plane began to fill up, the usual cacophony of luggage being shoved into overhead bins, kids whining, and people grumbling about seats. I popped in my headphones, ready to tune out the world and forget about the strange woman next to me. That was when the announcement came. Attention passengers, we apologize for the delay, but we've been informed there's been an issue with the flight manifest. We'll need to take a few moments to verify everyone's identification. Please remain seated while we resolve this. I didn't think much of it at first. Flight delays were nothing new. But then, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. They didn't look like the casual type. You know, the ones who are just there to say hello and smile. They were serious, scanning the rows, their eyes locking onto each passenger. Then one of them turned and whispered something into his radio. The air suddenly felt thick, like we were all waiting for something to explode. The woman next to me shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping on her knee in a rapid, nervous rhythm. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, my stomach churning with unease. She hadn't said a word since sitting down, hadn't even looked at anyone. But now, she was shaking. What are they looking for? I wondered, trying to push the thought from my head. The security officers slowly made their way down the aisle, their eyes moving deliberately from face to face. They were getting closer. My heart rate picked up. It's funny how paranoia works. Even though I had nothing to hide, the presence of authority always made me feel guilty. And then they reached our row. The officer in front paused. He looked directly at the woman next to me, his face completely expressionless. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Can we see your ID?" She didn't move. The officer exchanged a look with his partner before stepping forward. "Ma'am," he repeated, more insistently this time. "We need to see your identification." Her hands were shaking now, but she still didn't look up. Her breath had become shallow, almost panicked, and that was when I noticed something strange. The duffel bag she had tucked under the seat wasn't fully zipped. Something metallic was poking out from inside. My pulse quickened as my brain tried to process what it was seeing. It looked like a pair of handcuffs. I felt the cold sweat break out on my forehead. The officers saw it too. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us," the first officer said, his hand resting on the holster of his taser. And that was when all hell broke loose. In one terrifying, fluid motion, the woman grabbed the metal object from her bag, not handcuffs, but a jagged piece of metal, almost like a makeshift weapon. She sprang from her seat with an inhuman speed, the tip of the shard gleaming under the plane's fluorescent lights. "No one touch me," she screamed, her voice shrill and filled with sheer desperation. The passengers nearby screamed in shock, trying to shrink back into their seats, but there was nowhere to go. The officers tried to move in, but she swung the metal shard wildly, keeping them at bay. Her whole body trembled with adrenaline, her eyes wide with something far beyond fear. "No one's going to take me back," she screeched. "I'm not going back." And then it hit me. She had escaped. She wasn't just any passenger. She was a patient, probably from some mental facility. She must have slipped away, bought a ticket under some fake name, and now they had tracked her down mid-flight. But this wasn't some action movie. This was real, and she was losing it right in front of us. The officers kept their distance, trying to de-escalate. But nothing they said could break through her hysteria. "Just take a seat, everyone stay calm," one of them urged, though it was clear the situation was far beyond that. The woman was shaking so violently now, it seemed like her whole body might shatter into pieces. And I was sitting right next to her. Before I could even think, she turned towards me, her eyes locking onto mine. There was something in her gaze, a wild, pleading look that chilled me to the core. "Help me," she whispered, her voice broken. "Please. They're going to kill me. They said they'd kill me if I didn't." But she never got to finish that sentence. In one swift move, the officer lunged forward, taser in hand. The woman screamed as the prongs hit her, her body convulsing before she collapsed into the aisle, the makeshift weapon clattering to the floor. The passengers gasped in unison, the tension snapping like a tightrope pulled too far. For a moment, no one moved. The plane was dead silent except for the shallow breathing of the officer who had just saved our lives. But all I could do was stare at the woman, her face twisted in a grimace of pain, tears streaming down her cheeks. They dragged her off the plane, her hands cuffed behind her back. And as the door to the terminal slammed shut, I realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time. We had just hit cruising altitude when the plane started shaking. A typical flight to Rio de Janeiro, hot sun, blue skies, and a drink in hand, turned into something else entirely. It was one of those regional flights, barely 2 hours, so I wasn't expecting much more than a bit of turbulence. You know, the kind you laugh off while gripping the armrest and pretending not to care. But then came the noise, a deep, unsettling groan from beneath the floorboards. Everyone around me stopped their conversations, the usual clink of cups and ice disappearing into an eerie silence. I glanced around, but no one seemed to understand what was happening. The groan grew louder, like the plane was straining. Did the captain forget to check the engine or something? I muttered under my breath. The man next to me gave me a nervous smile, like he appreciated the joke but wasn't sure if he should laugh. Suddenly, the plane jolted violently, sending trays flying, drinks spilling, and people shouting in panic. I grabbed the seat in front of me, heart hammering against my chest. There's turbulence, and then there's whatever that was. The air felt electric, heavy with something I couldn't explain. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking. We seem to be experiencing an unexpected issue with one of the engines. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're going to make an emergency landing at the nearest airstrip." Nearest airstrip? In the middle of nowhere. I looked out the window. We were flying over a vast, endless green expanse. Nothing but jungle as far as the eye could see. No towns, no cities, just a sea of trees. Something twisted in my gut. Whatever that engine was doing, it didn't sound like something we could fix with a quick patch-up. The plane lurched again, and we dropped a sickening freefall that made my stomach churn. The oxygen masks deployed, dangling like puppets from the ceiling. Panic rippled through the cabin. I could hear people praying, some crying, others shouting questions no one could answer. The plane continued its rapid descent, engines whining in protest, like some colossal bird fighting against gravity. And then impact. It wasn't the fiery explosion you'd expect. It was more of a controlled crash, if there is such a thing. The plane skidded, metal screeching against earth, ripping through the trees until we finally came to a stop. For a second, there was silence. The kind that follows an accident when no one's sure if they're alive or dead. I blinked, hands still white-knuckled on the seat in front of me, ears ringing from the crash. Miraculously, the cabin was intact. People were groaning, blood trickled down a few foreheads, but most were alive. Dazed, but alive. "Is everyone okay?" the man next to me asked, shaking himself free of his seatbelt. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. The captain's voice crackled again, this time more panicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made an emergency landing. Please remain calm and stay seated until instructed." His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural scream. "What the hell was that?" the man next to me whispered. No one had an answer. Everyone just stared at each other, waiting, hearts pounding, for the next thing to go wrong. A flight attendant ran down the aisle, eyes wide with terror, muttering something I couldn't catch. She made a beeline for the cockpit, but just as she reached for the door, a loud crash reverberated through the plane. "That didn't sound like an engine problem," I said, my mouth dry. Suddenly, the plane's emergency doors burst open, and fresh air flooded the cabin, bringing with it an odd, musty smell. Not the scent of fuel or burning metal, something earthy, wet, alive. Passengers were scrambling to their feet now, pushing toward the exit. It was chaos, but something in the back of my mind screamed that staying inside the plane was worse than whatever was out there. I unbuckled my seatbelt and followed the crowd into the open air. What we saw when we stepped off the plane was unreal. The jungle surrounded us, dense and humid, but that wasn't what made my skin crawl. It was the ground. The entire area around the crash site was moving. At first, I thought it was the heat playing tricks on my eyes, but no, there were thousands of them. Maybe millions. Snakes. Everywhere. Slithering, hissing, writhing across the forest floor like some kind of cursed sea. Some as thick as my arm, others small and fast, darting between people's feet. The noise they made was deafening, a constant, terrifying hiss that filled the air. The captain had mentioned an airstrip, but it was clear there was nothing here but snakes and jungle. Someone shouted, "Stay on the wreckage. They can't climb metal." And just like that, a dozen people scrambled back onto the plane, desperate to put something solid between them and the slithering mass below. But it didn't matter. The snakes were pouring in from every direction, their eyes gleaming in the twilight, tongues flicking out as if tasting the air or us. A woman screamed as one of the larger ones latched onto her leg, coiling up with terrifying speed. She tried to shake it off, but its grip tightened, constricting like a living rope. Two men rushed to help her, but even from a distance, I could see their faces twist in horror as they realized the futility of it. "We have to get out of here," someone yelled. But where? We were surrounded. The snakes were endless, a living tide. I grabbed a piece of debris, holding it in front of me like a shield. Not that it would help. We were trapped, and the snakes were closing in. Then, in the distance, I spotted something, a tall rock formation. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards away, rising above the jungle like an ancient tower. If we could reach it, maybe we'd have a chance. Maybe. Without thinking, I bolted, leaping over the writhing mass of snakes, hearing their hisses grow louder as they sensed movement. A few others followed me, desperate, the fear in their eyes mirroring my own. We ran, dodging, stumbling, praying with every step that we'd make it. The snakes lunged at our feet, some catching onto legs, others snapping at the air, but somehow, I made it to the rock. I climbed, hands shaking, heart thudding, feeling the cold stone beneath my palms. When I finally reached the top, I looked down. Most didn't make it. The snakes were everywhere now, coiling over the wreckage, slithering through the jungle, and feasting on whatever they could find. It was a sight straight from hell, and all I could do was watch. Watch and wonder if anyone would ever find us, if anyone would believe what happened here. Because I wouldn't have believed it either. Not until I saw the horror for myself. They say flying is the safest way to travel. Sure, the occasional turbulence might jolt your nerves, and maybe the person next to you hogs the armrest, but overall, it's supposed to be a smooth experience. That's what I thought until I ended up on a flight I will never forget. I've always been a bit of a nervous flyer. Not the kind that grips the armrest and prays during takeoff, but I like to keep an eye on things. You know, just in case. So when I boarded this red-eye flight from Chicago to Tokyo, I was already on alert. It wasn't the kind of flight where anything seemed out of the ordinary, though. The flight attendants smiled, passengers settled into their seats, and the hum of the engines filled the air. Everything was normal until the food was served. I was in seat 23A, a window seat, which I regretted almost immediately because the guy next to me, a large man in a Hawaiian shirt who looked like he had never heard of personal space, plopped down and spread out as if the seat came with an annex. He smiled and said, "Hope you're not claustrophobic." I chuckled nervously, trying not to think about how my leg would fall asleep in 30 minutes. About 2 hours into the flight, they dimmed the cabin lights, and the flight attendants rolled out the carts. It's funny, I'd always heard people joke about airplane food being terrible, but I never really had any issues with it. Maybe it's because I didn't have high expectations. You can't mess up a plastic tray of chicken and rice, right? I got my tray and peeled back the foil, the steam rising like some kind of grand reveal. Chicken teriyaki. Not bad. The smell wasn't half bad either. I picked up my plastic fork and dove in, making small talk with my roommate who, despite being built like a linebacker, was nibbling his meal like a picky toddler. He poked at his chicken, sniffed it suspiciously, then shrugged before wolfing it down. As I ate, something odd happened. A weird tingling sensation crept down my throat. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Airplane air is dry, right? But then the tingling got worse. It was subtle at first, almost like that scratchy feeling when you're about to come down with a cold. But it kept getting stronger, spreading to my chest and stomach. I glanced around the cabin. No one else seemed to be reacting. Was it just me? I forced down another bite, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. It didn't taste bad. If anything, the food was bland, but my stomach was twisting like I'd swallowed a bag of nails. I put my fork down, the chicken half eaten. I figured it was best not to finish it. Maybe my body was just being weird because of the altitude. Then it hit me. The guy next to me let out a deep groan, clutching his stomach. At first, I thought it was just a bit of indigestion. You know, that full belly groan people make after eating too fast. But this wasn't that. His face had turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His breathing grew shallow, each breath rattling like a loose screw. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, half expecting him to laugh it off. But instead, he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "I don't feel so good," he muttered, his voice strained. And then it happened. Before I could react, he doubled over and threw up all over the seat in front of him. And not just a little bit. I mean, everything came up. His chicken teriyaki, rice, even chunks of what looked like a breakfast burrito. The smell hit me like a freight train, a mix of bile and sour food that made my stomach churn. I gagged, trying to turn away, but there was nowhere to go. We were 30,000 feet in the air, and I was trapped in a nightmare with a man who had just unloaded his stomach contents inches from my face. Panic started spreading through the cabin. I wasn't the only one feeling sick anymore. Passengers were clutching their stomachs, some doubled over in their seats, others rushing to the tiny airplane bathrooms. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, their faces strained as they tried to calm everyone down, but you could see it in their eyes, they were scared too. They didn't know what was going on. I felt the nausea build in my own stomach. I tried to hold it down, breathing deeply, but it was no use. My body was rejecting the food like it was poison, because, well, it probably was. I stumbled out of my seat, practically falling into the aisle as I made a desperate dash for the bathroom. But I wasn't fast enough. The sickness hit me hard, and I barely had time to lean over before I vomited all over the floor. It wasn't just a few people getting sick anymore. The entire cabin was in chaos. People were moaning, crying, vomiting. Some were passing out in their seats. It was like a scene out of a disaster movie, only this wasn't fiction. It was real, and it was happening to me. The flight attendants tried to keep things under control, but it was clear they had no idea what to do. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that we were making an emergency landing in Anchorage. But the landing was still hours away, and I wasn't sure how many of us would make it that long. I stumbled back to my seat, my body weak and trembling. The man next to me had passed out, his face a ghastly shade of gray. The vomit on the seat in front of him had started to pool on the floor, mixing with the mess I'd left behind. I pressed the button for a flight attendant, but no one came. The next few hours were a blur. I remember the sound of people retching, the smell of vomit thick in the air, I remember the flight attendants moving up and down the aisles, checking pulses, offering water, but it wasn't enough. It felt like we were all trapped in a flying coffin. When we finally landed in Anchorage, the paramedics boarded the plane. People were wheeled out on stretchers, oxygen masks strapped to their faces. I was one of the lucky ones, I guess. I could still walk. As they loaded us into ambulances, I overheard one of the paramedics talking to the pilot. They didn't know what had caused it yet, but there was one thing they were sure of: something in the food had poisoned us. I haven't flown since.